Fort Worth, Texas, 1974. 2 days before Christmas. 3 young girls, ages 17, 14, and 9, head out for a shopping trip at a local mall. The trio never returns home, and their abandoned car is found in the parking lot. The following morning, the husband of one of the missing girls receives a mysterious letter, which throws the whole case for a loop. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the second episode of The Trail Went Cold, a brand new podcast which tackles cold cases which are seemingly unsolvable mysteries. I am your host, Robin Warder, and if you listened to my first episode about the unexplained death of Aileen Conway, thank you for doing so, and I hope you liked it. I'm very happy with how this whole thing turned out, and while we're still working the kinks out, we have finally figured out a plan for this podcast. The Trail Went Cold will now have a bi-weekly schedule, and a new episode will be released every other Wednesday. And we've now got our own Facebook and Twitter pages set up, and we're also available for download on iTunes right now. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. And I'd also like to throw out another special thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and is also my fellow co-owner of The Back Row, the pop culture website which hosts this very podcast. And of course, I would also like to throw out a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes all of the creepy music you hear on this podcast for us. So yeah, I guess with all that out of the way, let's get started, shall we? Now, as I mentioned on our last episode, I am a frequent writer for both Cracked.com and Listverse.com, and I have published over 100 articles between the two websites. The majority of the articles at Listverse are true crime and mystery related because those are the subjects which are most popular with their readership over there. But I think a lot of the cases I've covered at Listverse are worthy of much more than just a 300-word summary and deserve some very in-depth analysis. So for this episode, I am going to be profiling the very first case I wrote about on the very first list I published at Listverse. The article in question was titled 10 Mysterious Disappearances of Multiple People and was published in April of 2013. And the very first item on that list was the case about a trio of missing girls known as the Fort Worth Three. This is a case which hardcore true crime buffs are probably familiar with, but it hasn't really gotten a lot of mainstream exposure that I know of. I've never seen this case covered in any documentaries or on any true crime shows, and if you type the term Fort Worth Three into YouTube, you're not going to get anything. So you might be familiar with another missing persons case from 1992 known as the Springfield Three. In that one, 2 teenage girls and the mother of one of these girls all mysteriously vanished at the same time from their home in the middle of the night. That case has always gotten a lot of play, like I've seen it on a lot of true crime shows like Disappeared, but for some reason I just haven't seen the Fort Worth 3 case get the same amount of exposure. But I think it's such a strange and unique missing persons case that I believe it deserves to be covered here. So our story begins over 40 years ago in Fort Worth, Texas. The first victim in question is 17-year-old Mary Rachel Trelisa, who goes by the name Rachel. Even though she's only 17, Rachel has actually been married for 6 months and lives with her husband, Tommy Trelisa. The second victim is Rachel's friend, 14-year-old Lisa Renee Wilson, who goes by the name Renee. And our third victim is 9-year-old Julie Ann Mosley, a neighbor who happens to be the younger sister of Renee's boyfriend, Terry Mosley. Anyway, on the afternoon of December 23, 1974, Rachel and Renee have planned a shopping trip to go buy some Christmas presents. Renee asks her boyfriend if he would like to come with them, but Terry says no. However, his youngest sister, Julie Ann, then asks Renee if she can tag along instead. The two teenage girls say yes, even though, as far as I know, Rachel barely knew Julianne at all before this day. So the three girls head on their shopping trip in Rachel's Oldsmobile, and the first thing they do is stop at an Army-Navy store to pick up a pair of jeans which were being held on layaway. Afterwards, they head to the Seminary South Shopping Center, which was the most prominent shopping mall in Fort Worth at that time. Rachel parks her car on the upper level near the Sears store, but after that, well, no one is really sure what happened. At some point during the day, Rachel Trelisa, Renee Wilson, and Julianne Mosley just vanished without a trace and would soon become known as the Fort Worth Three. The girls had said they'd be home from their trip by around 4 o'clock that afternoon because apparently Renee was planning to escort her boyfriend to a party that night, but when they didn't show up, their families became concerned. They eventually headed over to the shopping center, and at approximately 6 p.m., they discovered Rachel's locked Oldsmobile, which was still in its original parking space near the Sears store. The jeans the girls had picked up from the Army-Navy store were still inside, and there were also some wrapped Christmas presents for items they had presumably purchased inside the mall. There were a lot of witnesses who could confirm seeing the girls inside the shopping center that afternoon, and you know these sightings were probably credible because they specifically mentioned the t-shirt Renee was wearing that day, which had the words "Sweet Honesty" written on the front. Since those wrapped Christmas presents were inside the Oldsmobile, that seemed to indicate that the girls had returned to the car at some point after entering the mall, but no one can pinpoint the exact time they disappeared. Anyway, since the victims' families couldn't find them anywhere at the shopping center, they officially reported them missing. And this is where this story gets really, really weird. The following morning, which happens to be Christmas Eve, Rachel's husband, Tommy Trelisa, discovers an envelope in the mailbox outside their house, which is addressed to him, and the name Rachel is actually written in the upper left corner. Inside, Tommy finds a letter which reads, and I quote, "I know I'm going to catch it, but we just had to get away. We're going to Houston. See you in about a week. The car is in Sears' upper lot. Love, Rachel." Now, of course, the Oldsmobile had already been found at this point, so Rachel didn't really need to provide any directions about where the family could find the car. And unfortunately, the words in this letter did not turn out to be true, as Rachel, Renee, and Julianne did not return home the following week. Needless to say, Rachel's family was very skeptical about whether Rachel actually wrote this letter, but before we get into that, I think I should provide some context about how cases involving missing children were often handled back then. You see, after the girls were reported missing, the police initially assumed that they simply ran away, and I'm sure this letter probably did a lot to confirm their suspicions. They probably just assumed, well, they're just going to come back home in a week anyway, and they didn't do a lot of investigating. And unfortunately, that kind of mentality seemed to be fairly common back then. In my research, I have encountered countless cases from the 1970s and early 80s in which teenagers went missing from their families, and the police just wrote them off as runaways, even though there was no evidence to suggest they ran away. And because we were still over 20 years away from the Amber Alert at this point, this mentality seemed to extend to the Fort Worth 3 case. Now, I know Rachel was 17 and Renee was 14, so I guess it's not impossible that two teenage girls might feel the sudden compulsion to skip town and run away together. But here's the problem. They had a 9-year-old with them. Like I said earlier, Renee initially asked her boyfriend to come along on their shopping trip, and it was only after he said no that Julianne begged to come along instead. If Rachel and Renee were planning to run away, it's very unlikely they would have let Julianne come along with them. Now, if this case happened today, and a 9-year-old like Julianne disappeared under these circumstances, the authorities would be obliged to take the whole thing very seriously and immediately launch a search effort to find her. But back in 1974, they just did not give these disappearances the treatment they probably deserved. Now, obviously, the families of the missing victims were not too happy with how the police were handling things, so over the years they would hire some private investigators to look into the case, and this only seemed to take the case in even stranger directions. During the 1970s, a private investigator named John Swaim was hired by the families, and he supposedly uncovered some potential leads. Apparently, he had received information that the girls' remains could be found in some swampy bayou somewhere, but no one ever did find anything at the location he provided. And then, in 1979, Swaim commits suicide after a drug overdose, and per his request, all his personal records are destroyed, including all of his findings about the Fort Worth Three. So, if he actually did find some useful info about the Fort Worth Three, he took that knowledge to his grave, unfortunately. And it doesn't end there when it comes to the private investigators. In the late 1990s, there's this other private investigator named Dan James, and he gets in touch with Rusty Arnold, who is Rachel's younger brother. This James guy claims that he's uncovered information to suggest that Rachel and Renee decided to skip town that day because something bad happened to Julie Ann. Apparently there were some eyewitness sightings of Rachel and Renee alive together at several different locations in the days following their disappearance. During an interview, the actual words James used was that someone was shrouding and manufacturing evidence in an effort to keep Rachel and Renee hidden and away from Fort Worth. By the time James got in touch with Rusty in the late 1990s, he claimed that Renee was now deceased, but that Rachel might still be alive. James said that one of these sightings of Rachel apparently took place in Fort Worth in 1998 around Christmas time, because apparently Rachel liked returning to the Fort Worth area during the Christmas season, even though, as far as I know, she never got in touch with her family. Now, I really don't know what to make of this Dan James guy, because apparently he was working on and investigating the case for years, like long before the families even got in touch with him. And the problem is that he is very vague about providing specific details about what he thinks happened. He seems to only provide these cryptic statements to the press when he's interviewed, where he's implying that Rachel is still alive somewhere. So I just don't know how credible this guy really is, but at least in the late 90s, it sounded like Rusty at least believed him. So, but overall, I just don't know what to make of him. I mean, it's been over a decade now since Dan James provided all this information to the press, so I have no idea if he's still working on the case today. But before I share my personal thoughts, I still have some more details to provide about this story. I'm going to talk about a few eyewitness sightings. Apparently there was at least one female witness who was at the mall the same day the Fort Worth Three disappeared, and she told a store clerk she saw the three girls being forced into a pickup truck by an unidentified man. But as far as I can tell, the witness never actually spoke to the police, and they were never able to track her down to provide more official questioning. But as far as I can tell, the witness never actually spoke to the police, and they were never able to track her down to officially question her. In 1981, another witness came forward, and he said he saw a man forcing a girl, who may or may not have been one of the Fort Worth Three. He says she was being forced into a van by an unidentified man in the mall parking lot that day. When the witness approached this man, he was apparently told, "This is a family dispute," and the unidentified man told the witness to stay out of it. And then, in 2001, yet another witness came forward, and he claimed he saw the three girls in the mall parking lot at 11:30 p.m. on the same night of their disappearance, and this time they were inside a pickup truck belonging to a mall security guard. The witness claimed he did share this information with authorities way back in 1974, but apparently they never followed through on it. The witness must have identified a specific security guard, because the investigators were actually able to track him down and question him 26 years after the fact. However, the security guard denied this story was true and claimed that he never made any contact with the Fort Worth Three. So, yeah, there's a lot of bizarre stuff in this case, but I'm going to do my best to formulate some theories about what happened. I suppose I should provide the obligatory disclaimer here and remind everyone that all these theories I'm going to provide are my own personal views and should not be treated as fact. I've researched many sources of information about this case, but the main one is the website www.missingtrio.com. Now, this website is run by Rachel's family, but if you look at its design, it looks like it hasn't been updated in many, many years, possibly over a decade. So I don't know if any of the stuff they got posted there is outdated now, but a lot of the information I'm going to be discussing, particularly what I'm going to talk about next, it comes from the website. There seems to be a real wild card in this case, and that happens to be Rachel's older sister, Deborah, who was 19 years old at the time of Rachel's disappearance. That day, Rachel had actually asked Deborah if she would like to come along on their shopping trip, but Deborah declined and decided to stay home. And here's where things get a bit interesting. Before he got married to Rachel, Tommy Trelisa was actually engaged to Deborah before they broke it off. And at the time of Rachel's disappearance, Deborah was temporarily staying with Rachel and Tommy because she had gotten into a dispute with her current boyfriend. Now, of course, living in the same house with your ex-fiancé and his new bride, who also happens to be your sister, that sounds like an incredibly awkward situation, but apparently Deborah claims she wasn't bothered by it. However, it seems like the families of the missing victims have come to believe that Deborah might know something about the disappearances which she is not telling. In January 2000, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram did an article on the case, and Deborah was interviewed. At one point, she started talking about her brother Rusty, and she said these words, and I quote, "I know he blames me. I know he thinks I had something to do with it. Rusty thinks this letter that Tommy got the next day, he thinks I wrote it. I didn't write this letter. I don't know who did. I don't know what happened to my sister. Maybe white slavery? That's the only thing that makes sense to me. I have nothing to hide." Now, immediately following this interview, the other relatives of the three missing girls, including Rusty, they all wrote a letter to Deborah, and this letter is available for viewing at missingtrio.com, and I'm going to quote it word for word. "Dear Deborah, we read your statement in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram on January 9th, 2000. You indicated that you had nothing to hide. If your statement is true, we beg and plead with you to fully cooperate with the Fort Worth Police Department and the FBI. Please complete the polygraph testing and answer all questions. Deborah, please keep in mind you also have a sister missing. Respectfully, Rayanne Mosley, Rusty Arnold, Judy Wilson, and Richard Wilson." Interesting. Now, this information they got posted, it's 16 years old now, so I really have no idea if any of these people are still suspicious of Deborah or still believe that she's withholding information about the disappearances. And since I don't know any of these people personally, I'm not going to speculate about whether or not Deborah might be withholding something or if she actually wrote the mysterious letter. But I do think this is an appropriate time to analyze this letter. Now, right from the outset, the main reason everyone was so skeptical that Rachel actually wrote this letter was because the envelope was addressed to Thomas A. Trelisa, and apparently she never referred to Tommy as Thomas. After the handwriting was analyzed, Rachel's family found it very unlikely that she wrote the letter, but they had some handwriting experts perform some tests, and the results were inconclusive. But the main question I have is, how did this letter wind up in the mailbox to begin with? I find it hard to believe it was mailed the traditional way. Of course, I'm no expert on how the Postal Service operated in Fort Worth in 1974, but I just find it unlikely that a letter could be mailed on the afternoon or evening of December 23rd and wind up at its destination on the morning of the 24th. Because as I'm sure you're well aware, the Postal Service is always going to be ridiculously overloaded with deliveries around Christmas time, so I don't know how this letter could have shown up inside Tommy's mailbox so quickly. On the envelope, there was no city name on the postmark, and it also had a blurry postal number which looked like it could be 76083. There's been some speculation that the last two numbers were either stamped backwards, or that the 3 might have actually been a very blurry, incomplete 8. in which case the correct number could have either have been 76038 or 76088. And if either of those numbers is the correct one, then that would mean the letter would have had to have been mailed from either Eliasville or Weatherford, and those are two towns which are both a considerable distance away from Fort Worth. It's also worth noting that there was also a 10-cent stamp on the envelope which had been canceled on the morning of December 24th. So if I had to make a guess, I'd say that someone might have stuck the letter in a recycled envelope which was going to be used or had already been used for something else, and then just planted the envelope and the letter inside Tommy's mailbox. So if the letter was specifically addressed to Thomas Trelisa, does that mean it was written by someone who knew Rachel personally? Well, not necessarily. If Rachel was abducted by a stranger, she still could have told them that she had a husband named Tommy or Thomas, and it's not impossible that they could have learned Rachel's home address from her driver's license or something. So let's operate under the assumption that the letter was not written by Rachel, and look at how some potential abduction scenarios might have played out. Since the wrapped Christmas presents were found in the back of Rachel's Oldsmobile, that would indicate that the girls did return to the car at some point that day. But that doesn't necessarily mean they were about to leave and drive away right before they were abducted. If you've ever done a major shopping trip at a mall where you're planning to buy a lot of different items from different places, it's very common to go out and lock some of these items in your car before returning to the mall, and that's so you don't have to keep carrying everything around with you all day while you complete your shopping. Since Rachel's vehicle was found locked, I think it's certainly probable that they locked some presents in the car before heading back inside the mall at some point that day. My main issue with an abduction scenario is that it would have had to have happened in broad daylight. While I can't vouch for how busy the parking lot was, or if Rachel's car was parked in an isolated location or something, I do know that this was 2 days before Christmas, so I'd have to wager that there were a lot of people at the mall. So how could someone have kidnapped 3 people in broad daylight in a public parking lot without anyone seeing anything? Of course, we do have 3 separate eyewitness sightings. In many missing persons cases, there are often eyewitness sightings that turn out to be false, so let's look at the credibility of each of these. Let's start with the first witness who reported seeing the 3 girls being hustled into a pickup truck by an unidentified man. Even though this witness was never tracked down or questioned, I wouldn't entirely discount the sighting. If the police had not automatically written the girls off as runaways, they probably would have done a more thorough job at trying to track this witness down. The second witness, who came forward in 1981 and claimed he saw a girl being forced into a van, I don't put too much stock in him. I'm not saying the witness made the story up, but since the sighting involved only 1 girl and not 3, I think it's possible he did see a legitimate family dispute involving some other completely unrelated girl. Now, the witness who came forward in 2001 and claimed he saw the 3 girls in a pickup truck with a mall security guard that night, that story is just bizarre. It's strange enough that the girls would be spotted like this at 11:30 p.m., over 5 hours after Rachel's car was found. But the witness also claimed that the 3 girls looked relaxed and showed no signs of duress, even though they had technically been missing for several hours at this point. And if the security guard was trying to abduct them, why drive them back to the last place they were seen before they disappeared? Of course, it's possible the girls might have left the mall and spent the evening hanging out with his guard, doing some partying or something, and that something else could have happened to them after he drove them back to their parked car. But again, even though it's not implausible that 2 teenage girls might decide to take off and spend several hours hanging out with a stranger without calling their families, it just seems very unlikely that they would do this with 9-year-old Julie Ann in tow. So, overall, I don't put too much stock into this witness's story. But yet, I find the whole security guard angle very intriguing. I'm not saying this particular security guard who was named by the witness was involved, but I've got another scenario in mind. Like I said, if the girls were kidnapped by a complete stranger, it would have been very difficult to successfully abduct all 3 of them in broad daylight in a public parking lot. But what if someone could have lured these 3 girls to an isolated location to abduct them? What kind of person might be capable of pulling something like that off? Personally, I think it could be a mall security guard. If a security guard approached them and said, "You girls need to come with me," they would be more likely to follow a man in uniform. Hell, it wouldn't even have to be a real security guard. It could have just been some predator who somehow managed to obtain a guard's uniform and pass himself off as one. In my eyes, this is a pretty believable explanation for how these girls could have disappeared without anyone seeing anything. So, in the end, I have my doubts about the so-called sightings of Rachel that the private investigator Dan James reported. I have my doubts that any of these girls ran off or that anyone was hiding them. Sadly, I do believe that all 3 girls were murdered shortly after they vanished. As far as the letter goes, it's possible that the Fort Worth 3 were kidnapped by someone they knew, who then decided to write a fake letter from Rachel in order to throw everyone off the trail. Or the letter could have just been written by some unknown psycho who felt the need to torment the victims' families. Personally, I lean towards the latter theory, as anyone who is capable of abducting 3 young girls at the same time is capable of anything. So whoever was responsible, they have managed to get away with it for over 40 years. And I guess the trail went cold. That said, I am not giving up hope that this case could be solved someday. The families of the victims are still managing to keep this case in the spotlight. In December 2014, the media covered a vigil in which the families commemorated the 40th anniversary of the girls' disappearances by releasing 40 yellow balloons into the air from the very same parking lot where they disappeared. Each balloon represented a Christmas that the victims' loved ones have spent not knowing the truth. I also want to make mention of another similar missing persons case which took place only 3 months after this one. In March 1975, the Lyon sisters, 12-year-old Sheila and 10-year-old Catherine, they disappeared after taking a trip to a shopping mall in Washington, D.C. Now, the girls' remains have still not been found, but a suspect named Lloyd Lee Welch was actually charged with the murders last summer. The case isn't completely solved, but the fact that we may still have closure after more than 40 years, that just demonstrates that there's always hope to solve any mystery. Appropriately enough, the Lyon sisters case is located right below the Fort Worth 3 case in that Listverse article I wrote. So I can only hope that someday I will be able to classify both these cases as solved. So that about wraps things up. If you happen to have any important information about this case that has never been shared, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you have your own theory about what might have happened to the Fort Worth 3, I'd love to hear from you. Hell, if you have some interesting information that wasn't covered here, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email. I can be reached at robin.warder@primus.ca. That's ROBIN.WARDER@PRIMUS.ca. robin.warder@primus.ca. So be sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and iTunes, and you can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at cracked.com and listverse.com. And there's plenty of other non-true crime content I have written, which you can find right here at the back row. So that's it for this episode. Join me next time for another edition of The Trail Went Cold.
The Trail Went Cold is part of the Back Row Podcast Network. Visit the-back-row.com for more. The theme song was composed by Vince Nitro.